You have hobbies. Maybe you play guitar badly on weekends. Maybe you collect things no one else cares about. Maybe you spend 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon doing something completely useless that makes you inexplicably happy. You don't do these things to survive. You do them because something in you needs to. That something is not modern. It is not a product of civilization or leisure time or the internet. Or having too much free time and not enough meaning. That impulse to make something, to play, to create beyond the requirements of staying alive, is one of the oldest things about you. Your ancestors had hobbies, and the evidence for what they did with their free time is stranger, more beautiful, and more human than almost anything else the archeological record has ever given us. Let's start with a number, 2.5 hours. That is roughly how long the Hadza of northern Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer societies on Earth, whose way of life most closely mirrors that of your Paleolithic ancestors, spend on subsistence activities each day. Hunting, gathering, processing food. Maintaining tools, 2.5 hours. The rest of the day is, in a very real sense, theirs. Anthropologist James Woodburn at the London School of Economics spent years living among the Hadza and documented this in detail. The assumption that prehistoric life was a relentless, exhausting struggle for survival, every waking hour devoted to not dying, is simply not supported by the evidence. Your ancestors had time, significant amounts of it. The question is, what did they do with it? The answer begins 40,000 years ago in a limestone cave in southern Germany, where someone sat down with a vulture bone and spent hours carving 5 evenly spaced holes into it. This is the Jason-Klurstral flute, one of the oldest musical instruments ever found. It is not primitive. The holes are precisely positioned, the spacing deliberate, the craftsmanship careful. Whoever made it understood pitch. They understood that different hole spacings produce different sounds. They were not experimenting randomly, they were building something they had a mental model of in advance. And when they were done, they played it. Music as a hobby is at least 40,000 years old. Possibly much older, the bone flute is simply the oldest one that survived. Wood, stretched skin, hollow gourds, the instruments that came before left no trace. But the capacity for music is written into the human brain in ways that suggest it is far more ancient than any artifact we've recovered. Researcher Ani Patel at Tufts University, who has studied the neuroscience of music across cultures, found that the human brain's response to rhythm and melody is hardwired in ways that are distinct from other primates, suggesting music became part of our neural architecture long before recorded history. Your ancestors danced, they drummed, they sang, not because it helped them hunt, not because it made them safer, because it felt like something worth doing. Then there is art. In 1994, 3 spelunkers exploring a cliff face in southern France lowered themselves into a previously undiscovered cave. What they found inside has never fully stopped astonishing anyone who looks at it. Chauvet Cave contains paintings made approximately 36,000 years ago. Horses rendered with perspective and movement, lions drawn mid-stride, a woolly rhinoceros charging from the cave wall. The artists who made these images used shading. They used the natural contours of the rock to give their figures 3-dimensionality. They painted over and around each other, creating a layered visual narrative. They depicted animals they had never seen together in one place, suggesting imagination, composition, deliberate artistic choice. This was not communication in any simple functional sense. It was not a hunting map or a warning sign. It was art. Someone went deep into a cave far from the entrance, far from food or warmth or safety, and spent hours, perhaps days, making something beautiful by firelight alone. Researcher Jean Klotz, one of the world's leading authorities on prehistoric cave art, has spent decades analyzing these paintings and concluded that they represent not just technical skill, but an inner life, a capacity for symbolic thought, for aesthetic experience, for making meaning out of marks on a wall that is fully, recognizably human. The person who painted the lions of Chauvet Cave was not a primitive creature doing primitive things. They were an artist, and the work they left behind is, by any serious measure, extraordinary. But it wasn't only music and painting. The evidence for ancient leisure is broader, stranger, and more touching than that. In Blombo's cave in South Africa, Archaeologists found 75,000-year-old perforated shell beads, tiny nacreous shells with carefully drilled holes, almost certainly strung together as jewelry. The nearest coastline was 20 kilometers away. Someone walked 40 kilometers round trip specifically to collect these shells, then spent additional hours drilling precise holes through them with stone tools. This was not food, it was not shelter, it was not a weapon. It was an ornament. Someone wanted to look a certain way. They had a sense of personal style, of self-presentation, of what it meant to decorate yourself 75,000 years ago. Archaeologist Francesco Derrico at the University of Bordeaux, who has studied these beads extensively, argues that they represent something profound. Evidence of what he calls modern behavior, the capacity to think symbolically, to assign meaning to objects beyond their physical properties, to care about how you appear to others not just in terms of threat or status, but in terms of something we might simply call aesthetics. Your ancestors were vain. Not in a shallow way, in a deeply human way. They looked at a shell and thought that would look good. They made it into something beautiful. They wore it. They also played games. The evidence for prehistoric play is harder to pin down. Games leave few physical traces, but it is there. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, documented by anthropologist Peter Gray at Boston College, consistently show that children and adults in these communities spend substantial time in unstructured play, wrestling, throwing things, chasing, storytelling, mimicry. Gray's research suggests that play in hunter-gatherer societies is not a break from life, it is a central feature of it. Children are not separated from adult activities and given structured educational tasks. They play, observe, imitate, and learn through doing in a seamless continuum that doesn't look much like what we call childhood. Adults played too, throwing competitions, tracking games, wrestling, storytelling, which is perhaps the oldest and most universal form of human play, the one that left the deepest mark on our brains. Researcher Jonathan Gottschall at Washington and Jefferson College, who has studied the evolutionary origins of storytelling, found that narrative, the telling and receiving of stories, activates the human brain in uniquely deep ways, engaging emotion, memory, social modeling, and meaning-making simultaneously. Story is not entertainment. It is, at the neural level, how humans process experience and transmit knowledge. Every campfire story your ancestors told each other was doing something real and important in their minds. They gathered and told stories. They made each other laugh. They had inside jokes that died with them. They had favorite performers, the ones who told the best stories, who could make the whole group go quiet, who made children sit still by firelight and listen. Here is what all of this tells you: the capacity for leisure, for music, for art, for decoration, for play, for story is not a luxury that emerged after civilization made life comfortable enough to afford it. It is ancient. It predates agriculture. It predates pottery. It predates cities and writing and money and everything we think of as the foundations of human culture. It predates all of them because it is the foundation. The same brain that learned to track prey across a savanna also learned to make the tracking into a story. The same hands that napped flint into blades also drilled holes in shells and carved birds out of mammoth ivory. The same voice that called warnings across a valley also sang. Researcher Stephen Mithen at the University of Reading, who has studied the cognitive evolution of early humans, argues that the emergence of what he calls cognitive fluidity, the ability to combine thinking from different domains, to make metaphors, to apply the logic of one domain to the problems of another, was the single most important cognitive development in human history. And he argues that this fluidity shows up first not in tools or weapons, but in art, in music, in the moment when a prehistoric human looked at a cave wall and thought, I could make something here. You make things, you play, you tell stories, you collect objects with no practical value. You listen to music that does nothing for your survival but makes you feel, briefly, like the world makes sense. This is not a modern indulgence. It is the oldest thing about you. The first humans who sat around a fire and played not because they had to, but because something in them insisted, were doing something that looks, from 40,000 years away, exactly like what you're doing right now. They were being human.